I'm now joined by Savett, Deputy Spokesperson, National Security Council. I have so many questions I want to ask you, but everybody around here is like, yo, bro, this has to be quick. So let's jump right in.
Sounds good.
I want to go to the big areas that we are familiar with and just, listen as you tell us Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, all over the globe, it seems.
Mm-hmm.
Warfare, conflict, things of that nature. What's the role of the National Security Council vis-a-vis these issues?
Sure. Well, first, thank you for having me on. It's good to be talking to you today. The role of the National Security Council is to carry out the president's foreign policy initiatives and to interface between the White House, Department of State, Department of Defense, the intelligence community. We're a coordinating arm to carry out the president's policies and responsibilities of protecting the American people, rebuilding and investing in our military readiness, restoring America's leadership abroad, in each of the areas that you named. In Ukraine, for example, when Russia invaded Ukraine in early 2022, President Biden pulled together this global coalition of more than 50 countries from across the world to stand up to Russia, to make sure Ukraine had what it needed to defend itself, to defend its freedom and independence. We're doing that by investing in American manufacturing here. We've invested in growing manufacturing and production lines in nearly 40 states across the country, producing weapons and equipment that were given to Ukraine to defend themselves against the atrocities that the Russian forces and Putin's army is committing there. On Israel and the Middle East, we're currently working hard to achieve a hostage deal, a temporary ceasefire that would enable the release of the 130 hostages that Hamas has been holding for more than 140 days to be returned to their family in exchange for some type of sustained pause in the fighting. We're also working hard to get more humanitarian aid into Gaza right now because so many people are suffering as a result of this conflict, which Hamas started on October 7th when they attacked Israel. And, we have a lot of things that we're working hard at every single day, working to protect the American people, keep them safe. I don't want to ramble on too much, though, before you go to your next question.
A few years back, there was a moniker created called Black Identity Extremists. How did that come about such that, and you would have to go through the profile. Where did that come from such that Black identity extremism became a target or seen as a threat, seen as a national threat? Take me into the thinking of how that happened.
Well, I'm not familiar with the term myself, so I should say that at the start. But broadly speaking, I know you had mentioned during the break you wanted to ask about domestic terrorism, and one of the things the president directed once he came into office was creating the first ever strategy to counter domestic terrorism, and that was really inspired by what happened in Charlottesville, which is obviously a little bit different. That was a bunch of white supremacists and KKK marching through the streets in Charlottesville, carrying torches and shouting, "Jews will not replace us." That was something that President Biden has spoken about extensively as something he was horrified by. So he comes into office, he directs the creation of this strategy to make sure that our federal government is not only monitoring this threat, which is really pervasively seen by lone wolf actors, people who tend to sit alone in their basement, spend too much time online, reading things online and getting radicalized, but preventing them from being able to carry out acts of violence. So making sure that we don't have, as readily available flow of guns and weapons on the streets, making sure that there's federal resource sharing. So we're offering grants to churches, to, houses of worship, to schools, so they can do better security training and so forth to protect against the many acts of domestic terrorism that we've seen in the last few years alone.
So let me ask you one quick question. It might be unfair. You might not have enough space for it. So I was looking at the fact that there is a national strategy to address anti-Semitism.
Yep.
There's a declared national strategy to address Islamophobia.
Yep.
There's a declared national strategy at the time to address any acts of violence or intimidation against LGBTQ communities, things of that nature. I've never seen a national strategy to address anti-Blackness. When the HBCU threats happened, nobody declared the national strategy for anti-Blackness. Is there a reason for that? I see it when it's coupled with a lot of other dynamics, but I've never seen it stand alone as a declared thing that needs to be addressed specifically.
It's a very good question and a very good point. So one of the priorities President Biden, when he ran for office, talked about the rise in hate in America, and he loves, and he's fond of saying that, he thought hate goes away, but unfortunately he was wrong. It just hides, and I think that has been core to his message when he talks about restoring the soul of America. And when he came into office with, the countering domestic terrorism strategy, unfortunately, a lot of the instances of domestic terrorism we've seen have been acts of violence against Black people, anti-Black violence. We think about the shooting at the supermarket in Buffalo, for instance.
Right.
Yeah, it just comes to mind right away. And
we have enough acts.
Oh yeah,
I'm just not sure why we don't have a national strategy because we have the acts.
Sure. So I'll tell you that it's a priority of the Homeland Security team here is protecting Black communities against violence, especially hate-fueled violence. So you mentioned the HBCU bomb threat that happened last year. So when we first learned reports of that, we heard from HBCUs. We saw it in the news immediately. The Homeland Security advisor here at the White House, the president asked her to look into it, to assemble a team to make sure that we were offering resources to HBCUs to ensure that they knew how to report these threats, and made sure they had a line of communication to law enforcement at the highest levels, and make sure that we were providing them with the resources to protect their schools and their communities. And so I know that was a real priority here at the White House. And more broadly speaking, protecting Black people, protecting communities of color from this hate-fueled violence is absolutely a priority for the president.
I really do wish we had a lot more time to speak and talk about these matters, because this is an area of interest for me. But I'm getting the signal that says, Sean, oh, now I'm getting a different signal that says, keep chatting. Okay. All right. So what constitutes, what goes into the threat assessment process? What makes someone or an entity or a thing a threat? And then also what goes into the threat victimization process? How are you targeted as someone who would commit or a group that would commit a threat such that it receives high priority and then warrants a national strategy?
Sure. So a lot of this work begins within the intelligence community, begins in law enforcement agencies, looking at the broader trends of what they're seeing, analyzing the data. And one of the taskings actually from the strategy of national to counter domestic terrorism that I mentioned earlier was to ensure that we are categorizing acts of domestic terrorism, make sure that that's tracked so that we have the information in the data. And then once intelligence analysts are able to put pieces together, they see a trend line, whether it's bomb threats against HBCUs or other community organizations or places of worship, and they see this as becoming more of an emerging threat. Then we can assign resources to it. That gets flagged, for lack of a better term, within law enforcement, within the intelligence community. Then they will develop some type of basically what's called an intelligence community assessment, where they warn based on the the data they're seeing, just how concerning is that, and from there, law enforcement resources are then divvied up on the federal level. Now, our network of law enforcement, it's federal, state, local. It's not that the White House is obviously not involved in individual law enforcement decisions and is not doling out, telling law enforcement how to allocate their priorities. But we do ask for money from Congress every year that we can then channel into grants that can then go towards specific types of organizations that we believe are a greater threat. And so that's the broader process of how it works here.
So I'm a Black male. I'm a parent of Black males. I live in the city. Most of my work is with Black males. Here's my question. My concern is that when you look at terrorism and how the national strategy identifies a potential terrorist, and talks about young men of a certain age who are often disenfranchised, who are often marginalized, who feel like they're being persecuted, and then they get quote unquote radicalized, right? So there's this profile, and that profile sounds a lot like me and the young men I work with here. My concern is that the way that society is structured could potentially lead to many young Black males being labeled as domestic terroristic threats. How do we make sure that the approach to counterterrorism does not unfairly impact, incarcerate Black males?
It's a very good question. And obviously, if we're going to talk about systemic racism, we could talk all day about that. And that's not a quick answer. But what I can say, at least on the federal level, as the National Security Council here, as we look at domestic terror threats, the category the FBI uses is REMV, racially motivated violent extremists. And the vast majority of the REMV targets that they see are not black males. They are two categories. It's one, it's usually white supremacists more than anything else, but people who are driven by some type of racial animus and hate to commit some acts of terrible violence. Buffalo being an example of a REMV shooting. We also, a more famous example in the late 2010s was ISIS. You had people who were being radicalized at home. They were seeing on social media videos from the Middle East of ISIS beheadings and so forth. And then from there, they getting radicalized, that becomes a threat and something that we need to counter. But I can say, at least on the federal level, the focus of our strategy against domestic terrorism has been those two categories primarily. Those are it's not targeting any group of individuals, it's targeting individuals who may commit acts of violence and preventing them from committing acts of violence that can impact other people.
Well, I would like you to, when you get the chance, familiarize yourself with the Black identity extremism phenomenon that was about 3-4 years ago, and make sure that it doesn't manifest in a different coded way. But absolutely. I appreciate your time. Sean Savett, Deputy Spokesperson of the National Security Council.